Okay, so for all of these, like I said, we're going to use the percent of change formula. So we're looking for percent of change over 100 equals amount of change over original. So we're going to have to do some digging, figure out what kind of information we're given, what kind of information we're looking for. So number one says the Fergusons' real estate taxes went from $1,560 to $1,638. What was the percent of increase? Okay, so for these ones, like I said, instead of it giving you in a chart, it's just in a sentence or a couple sentences. So what I like to do is I like to write down the information that I may or may not be given. Because all of these percent of change problems deal with three things. They deal with the original price, the new price, and percent of change. So that's what I'm going to do first. I'm just going to write original and new and percent of change. And then I'm going to reread the problem and figure out where these numbers belong. And once I figure out where these numbers belong, I can find out what I'm looking for. So I have two numbers. I have 1,560 and I have 1,638. Okay? Neither of those are percents, right? They're both just regular numbers. So since I don't have a percent, that tells me that that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the percent of change. And if you read the problem, it tells you that, right? What was the percent of increase? So that's what we're going to be looking for in this problem. So that means that the other two numbers that I have are my original and my new. So we're talking about their real estate taxes, and they went from 1,560 to 1,638. So which of those numbers is my original? James? Very good. 1,560, because that's what it started out as, which means my new would be that 1,638. Okay, then before you set up your proportion, one other good thing to make a note of is whether we're talking about an increase or a decrease, because we learned yesterday that there is a difference between the two, how you calculate things. So if it went from 1,560 to 1,638, was this an increase or a decrease? Okay, an increase, and it actually tells us that, doesn't it, at the very end, percent of increase. Okay, and then let's remember yesterday to find the amount of change, it's going to change whether I have an increase or a decrease. If I have an increase, okay, we wrote this in your notes, but I want to make sure you guys understand where I got that from, because on your quiz, either tomorrow or Friday, you're not going to be able to use your notes, okay? So if it's an increase, that means my new price was more than my original, and if I always want that amount of change to be positive, I need to take the larger number minus the smaller number. So if my new price is more, I'm going to take my new minus the original. Okay, so this is how we're going to find the amount of change. Now we can go through and set up a proportion. So our proportion is percent over 100, and since we don't know what the percent is, that's where the variable will go. So x over 100 equals amount of change, and then we just said that amount of change, we're going to take the new minus the original over, what goes in the denominator? Original. Original always goes in the denominator, so we're going to put 1,560 in the denominator, okay? Once you have your proportion set up, you can go ahead and start solving. So I need to subtract 1,638 and 1,560, so we'd have x over 100 equals, and when you subtract those, you get 78 over 1,560. And whenever you have your proportions simplified, multiply up and across. 100 times 78 gives me 7,800. And then my other cross product gives me 1,560x. Divide both sides by 1,560. And we should get x equals what? 5. 5 what? What are we talking about? Percent. Very good. This was a 5% increase from one probably year to the next. Okay? Questions on number 1. Okay, about half of your problems are this. If you're asked to find the percent of change, those ones are pretty easy, right? The proportions aren't too tricky. So, like I said, about half of your homework problems are looking for percent of change. Okay? Want to go on number 2? All right, number 2. Number 2 tells me the number of registered voters in Franklin increased by 14% over the last year. There are now 9,633 registered voters. How many voters were there last year? Okay, so once again, let's write down our 3 possibilities. We have original, new, percent of change. And let's go back and see what parts of these, what I know, and then whatever one I don't know, that's what I'm trying to find. So the easiest one to pick out is percent of change. Was I given a percent? Yeah, I was given a 14% as my percent of change. And then whenever you write down your percent, kind of like I said before, kind of a good idea to make note whether it was an increase or decrease. Was this one an increase or a decrease? Increase. It says it increased by 14%. Okay, so it was a 14% increase. Okay, now, so if I fill in that one, that means I either have an original or I have a new. So if I look at that 9,633, it says there are now 9,633 registered voters. Is that number my original or my new? It's my new. Very good. Which means I'm looking for the original. Okay? And then before we set up our proportion, let's figure out how we are going to find our amount of change. So since this is an increase, remember when it increases, my new is greater than my original. So to find the amount of change, we're going to take new minus original. Okay? Now we can set up our proportion. So we're going to have percent over 100 equals amount of change, which we just said was my new minus the original over, what's going to go in my denominator? X, my original, which I don't know is going to be X. Okay, when you set up your proportion, go ahead and multiply your cross products. So I'm going to have 100 times the quantity, 9,633 minus X, equals my other cross product, which is 14X. And then just like yesterday, if you want to distribute that 100, go ahead. If you want to divide it out, you can do that as well. Dividing by 100 just moves the decimal 2 places to the left. So I have 9,633 minus X equals 0.14X. Notice I have X's on both sides of my equal sign, so I need to get them in one place. So if I add X to both sides, keep in mind that's a 1X. So 0.14X plus 1X gives me 1.14X. And on the other side, I have 9,633. And when you divide both sides by 1.14, we get X equals... Anybody? Very good. 8,450 what? Voters. Have to have the labels. You got to tell me what we're talking about. Otherwise, I'm going to assume you're talking about pounds of ground beef. Okay? Right? But we're not. We're talking about voters, right? But if you don't tell me that, I can make assumptions like that. But if you tell me voters, I'll be like, okay, we're talking about voters here. Okay? All right? Questions on number 2? Okay, like I said, most of your homework assignments are going to be like either number 1 or number 2. Number 3 is going to be completely different, okay? But the last 2 homework problems are going to be done exactly like number 3. So if you haven't been paying attention during number 1, number 2, you need to pay attention here, okay? But it's not new stuff. We've done problems like number 3 before. You guys excited? You know what we're going to use? Charts. Yeah, no, not aw. Say yeah! Charts! Woo! No, nobody's gonna. Okay, fine. So we're gonna use a chart, okay? Now, if you remember when we made a chart, one of the big important parts, they had to have that equation at the top. You guys remember that? Well, I already gave you the equation. Remember that very first thing that I had you guys write down? That's gonna be our equation that goes at the top of the chart, okay? We're gonna take the amount times the interest rate, and that's going to tell me how much interest I earn. Okay? So we've kind of got our chart made. I'm going to read back through the problem, see what I can fill in, okay? So I see that Jerry has $8,000 invested in stocks that give him a total annual income of $550. If part of the stocks pay 8% a year and the remainder pays 6.5% a year, how much money is invested in the stocks at each rate? Okay, so a couple things. First, if you remember with the charts, usually one column is super, super easy to fill out. It tells you. So looking at your information, looking at all those numbers, what numbers can I plug right into my chart? Which one? The percents, right? I have two different types of investments here. I have some money that I am investing at 8%, and I have some money that I'm investing at 6.5%. That's what the rate is. The rate will be a percent. Okay, now the reason why I couldn't just plug $8,000 into the amount, because he's not investing $8,000 in 8% and $8,000 in 6.5%, right? He has $8,000 and he's investing some at 8% and then the other at 6.5%, okay? Now, other than the fact that he invested $8,000, I don't know anything else about how much money. I don't know that he invested twice as much at 8% as 6.5%. They don't tell me that. So when this happens, you're going to do this for, and it wasn't just these types of problems. It was back in chapter 3 and 4 that we did this too. If we don't know anything else except for the total, we're going to pick a variable. So let's say we pick X, and I'm going to say Jerry invested X amount of money at 8%. Now, if he invested $8,000 total, this much money at 8%, how would you find out how much money he invested at 6.5%? Eric? Very good. 8,000 minus the amount of money that he invested at 8%, which was X dollars, right? Okay, and then thinking back to the last time we used charts, how do you fill in that last column? Very good. Multiply across. Now, whenever I multiply across, I would get 8% times X, but we don't multiply with percent. So what's 8% as a decimal? 0.08x. Okay, now this is the tricky one. This one that gets everybody. What's 6.5% as a decimal? 0.065, right? You have to move that decimal 2 times. So we're going to 0.065 times 8,000 minus x. Okay, now, last thing, thinking back to the charts, I told you with the charts, and it's been a while, slept since then, usually you're going to do one of two things once you have your chart filled out to write your equation. You are either going to set these equal to each other or add them together and set them equal to a total. Okay? So to decide this, we kind of need to interpret our chart and then we need to read back to the information given. So what this chart means, this interest right here, this is how much money he is earning on this amount of money. This is how much money he's earning on this amount of money. Okay, so how much money he's making off the 8% interest and how much money he's making off the 6.5% interest. If I go back and read my problem, it says his stocks gave him a total annual income of $550. What am I going to do with these numbers? How'd you know that? Total? Total? Doesn't total mean addition? Right? Keywords? Okay? So yes, we're going to add these two together and set them equal to a total. So I'm going to take 0.08x plus 0.065 times the quantity 8,000 minus x equals his total annual income, which was $550. Okay, and then once you have your equation, then we can start to solve. So if I distribute that 0.065, I have 0.08x plus, and 0.065 times 8,000 gives me 520 minus 0.065x equals 550. If I combine like terms, 0.08x minus 0.065x gives me what? 0.015x plus 520 equals 550. And then it's a two-step equation, so subtract 520 from both sides, and I have 0.015x equals 30. Divide both sides by 0.015, and x equals 2,000, which is wonderful. I found out what x is. Feeling pretty good about life, right? Okay, this doesn't mean anything if you can't tell me what x is, if what this means, if you can't answer my question. The question said, how much money is invested in the stocks at each rate? Okay, so let's start with x. X is $2,000, but what is x? Very good. Go back to your chart. X is the amount of money invested at 8%. So this $2,000, that's how much money he invested at 8%. He also invested some at 6.5%. If he invested $2,000 at 8%, how much did he invest at 6.5%? $6,000. All the rest of it. Very good. Make sense? Okay, the last two problems. You will do this same way. You will set up a chart, write your equation, so on. Any questions?